All right, now let's turn to our correspondent in New York, Nathan King, for more about the General Assembly and also Premier Li Keqiang's remarks at the meeting. Hello there, Nathan. First of all, tell us more about Premier Li's comments over the refugee issue.
Yeah, very much so. Remember, this is the second summit in as many days. This is the leadership summit convened by the United States President Barack Obama to try and get world leaders to pledge more material support for refugees and migrants. And Li Keqiang, of course, reminded leadership that China had pledged already $100 million extra on top of what they had already pledged, but also then pledged in $50 million increments more aid available through the South-South mechanism, largely to developing countries, to help with refugees and migrants. And the total will come to about $300 million, which is about 10% on its own of the $3 billion that US President Barack Obama and others had hoped to raise as well. So that's very good news. Also talking about how the world has to basically recognize that refugees and migrants are peoples with hopes and dreams and see them as individuals, not just the numbers. The 65.3 million refugees and migrants that we now have, the highest number any time since the Second World War. You know, given that some countries, especially in Europe and here in the United States, have been reticent about accepting refugees and migrants, this meeting and the pledges, people hope, will go some way to uniting the global community and tackling the problem without putting up barriers.
Well, Nathan, Premier Li has met with a group of leading figures in the U.S. Financial think tank and the media circles. What was discussed and what else is on Premier Li's agenda?
That's right, the Economic Club of New York, which is a very influential organization here in New York. Li Keqiang, the keynote speaker, introduced by Henry Kissinger, of course, who, with other Chinese officials like Zhou Enlai 45 years ago, helped bring the US and China back together again. And as Li Keqiang said, led to something which is quite remarkable. A third of all global trade is now between the US and China. China accounting for 50% of global growth at the moment. But it was a reassuring speech as well from Li Keqiang about China's lowering growth rate. He said even though because of the world financial crisis trade is down, that China's growth rate between 6 and 7% is needed. It's a more stable growth rate and will help bring the remaining Chinese out of poverty, stressing that China is still a developing country, unlike the US, which is a developed country. And he also encouraged his US audience to invest in China and allow more Chinese investment in the US, and said that even though they may have differences on some issues, the interdependence of the economies was actually an engine for global growth, and therefore more rules to make it easier to trade and invest should be established. So it was a very, very high-level speech. The New York Economic Club is very powerful, lots of Wall Street types and lots of influential policymakers as well. He also met earlier with former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary at the time of the US economic crisis, and the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, as well. He actually made a joke about Chinese people buying Apple iPhones at the rate of one every 2 seconds while he was in the Big Apple, New York. And of course, the two countries are working on a bilateral investment treaty where China would like to see more Chinese products like Huawei products, technology products, sold in the US. So there's lots of discussions like that. Going forward, in the next 24 hours, Li Keqiang will give us a keynote speech here at the General Assembly behind me, following on from the successful G20 summit in Hangzhou. He's hoping, world leaders are hoping to hear more about a sustainable growth model for the world economy, which includes all countries, and of course an environmentally friendly one going forward as well. So lots happening, and then he's meeting with Chinese leaders, business leaders here in New York, and some Chinese children as well, before heading to Canada on the next leg of his North American trip.
Right, thank you very much, Nathan King, reporting from the UN headquarters in New York.